So, yesterday saw the return of Kate Stewart and Unit as a whole in Survivors of the Flux. We also found out the purpose of the division and a lot more. And on the whole, I really enjoyed it. It wasn't nearly as good as last week's. It had a few issues, but I did really enjoy it. So let's start off by talking about the Doctor, of course played by Jodie Whittaker. She was great in this episode. I loved all her interactions with Tecteun. I thought they were great. Her talking about the fact that Tecteun stole her life. I thought her performance was really good, as it has been throughout the whole series. And I did enjoy the stuff with her and Tecteun. I thought that was really interesting. I thought it was a clever twist having her memories stored in a fob watch. It was great seeing the Ood back. It was just nice seeing them as an inclusion, as it made sense, and I thought Tecteun was a really interesting character and worked well in this episode. Although I do have to say the reveal of the old woman being Tecteun was a bit obvious, and Tecteun being behind the division, whilst it makes sense, is slightly underwhelming. It doesn't really feel like we've learned anything new. The flux was caused by this thing we already knew, led by this person we already knew. That would be the complaint I have with this episode, but it does all make sense, just ever so slightly underwhelming. The stuff with the companions I really enjoyed, although I will say that's probably my least favourite part of the episode, just because everything else I found to be really interesting. Although I did like it, it was very Indiana Jonesy. I thought Yaz particularly stood out as a great character, and I think her moments with stuff like the hologram 13th Doctor, they were all really good. John Bishop as Dan again was excellent, as he has been throughout all the series, and Jericho here was great. He's a nice little inclusion to make a mini companion trio. I know technically he's not a companion like Vinder, but let's be honest, Vinder, him, they just kind of are. Joseph Williamson was a really interesting inclusion here. I like the fact that his tunnels have finally been revealed to be like gateways between different planets. That's a really interesting idea. I'm really looking forward to see how that will factor into the finale. I think once again, he's been a really interesting character. I think Steve Orum's performed him really well. He genuinely feels like someone out of the 1800s, and I thought his interactions here were really funny. Carvanista remains great as always, so does Belle. They didn't really do much this episode, but I thought I'd mention them here. And I think probably the standout, at least for me in this episode, was the Grand Serpent, who acted as like the main villain in the story. It was great. I loved everything about his story. Seeing him infiltrating Unit from the beginning and working his way up, eventually seeing Kate Stewart, which she was also great, although it was nothing more than really like an extended cameo, but luckily she is in it next week and will have a much bigger role, so that is great. But yeah, she was great. But I loved seeing him just interfering throughout Unit, and seeing the progression of Unit from the 50s all the way up to the modern day. It's really interesting seeing how Unit have been so absent from the Chibnall era so far, to then just see a whole episode dedicated to their origins and how they've progressed throughout the years. And I think the Grand Serpent was performed really well as well. I think the villains this series have been particularly good. The Santarans have been handled excellently, Swarm and Azure are great villains, the Weeping Angels were great, and now the Grand Serpent's proven himself to be really interesting as well. I'm interested to see how, if he will indeed factor into the finale, seeing as he was working for the Sontarans and they seem to be taking over as like main villains almost for the finale, but yeah, that will be really interesting to see. Swarm and Azure, they were just Swarm and Azure. They didn't really do much in the brief moments they got. They were just brilliant, as they always have been. Again, Vinder didn't do much in this episode, but in the tiny moment he got, he was pretty good. I think, at least for me, this episode worked really well with all its different storylines. Something like the Halloween apocalypse, I felt like having lots of storylines playing at once didn't work well, as it wasn't handled particularly well in that episode. But here I think it was handled as well as it could have been. I think the only things that slightly let this episode down is the fact that the exposition about the division and things was not delivered maybe in the best way, and the answers to who's behind the flux was slightly underwhelming, and we all saw the Tecteun twist coming. Also, after last week's great cliffhanger, this one was just a bit rubbish, really. That being said, loved all the stuff with Unit and the Grand Serpent. The Kate Stewart bits were great, the companion stuff was interesting, and I really liked seeing the Doctor's interactions with Tecteun. Overall, I think I'm going to give this episode 4 out of 5 Seals of Rassilon. I thought it was a great setup for what seems to be an epic finale. And that's all I have to say on the episode. What did you think? Leave your thoughts down in the comment section below. Remember to like and subscribe in the meantime. I've been Cyberman Alf, and from me for now, it's goodbye.